With the M17 already in service and the M7 on the way as a currently serving soldier in an MOS that dual carries pistol and rifle, it's high time I take a closer look at the controversies surrounding these weapons and figure out, how screwed am I? So let's get after it. I'm James Merritt, Emergency Manager and Career Soldier, and this is Readiness Nation. So, in light of the airman who was killed by his own service weapon, presumably discharging uncommanded, we need to have a look at the sidearm in the arms room right now with my name on it. If you're new here, I've been in the US Army for 21 years now, having started out as an enlisted combat medic. I then commissioned as an infantry officer, and now I'm a civil affairs officer. And I talk about this in the intro video for Readiness Nation GQC, which was never released because I haven't launched GQC as a spin-off channel yet. But my first 3 degrees are actually in technology, specializing in the organizational sciences, which can best be described as building and optimizing the human elements of the organization, building and optimizing the technological elements of the organization, and most valuably, effectively integrating the human and the technological elements to maximize the competitive advantage of the firm. Now, normal people with degrees like mine are chief technology officers. Weirdos try to apply this body of knowledge to civilization as the organization in question. But talking about what technology should be adopted into service in an organization and why is core to my primary degree set. Furthermore, in undergrad, I got cross-training in every element of the technology development cycle, from it being an idea in a guy's head all the way to it being an actual product on the shelf for people to buy. So I have the necessary technical background in things like technical drawing, material science, machine processes, and industrial statistics to make sense of things that anyone who doesn't have a technical background may miss or just not understand. And one last point before we get started. I have absolutely no relationship with SIG, aside from having an M17 currently assigned to me by the US Army. I don't personally own any SIG weapons. I don't own any SIG stock, and I've never been employed by SIG. So I'm personally agnostic on the subject of SIG. However, I want to like them. I want to have faith in the equipment issued to me by the Army. And on the trajectory we're currently on, if I go downrange again, my soldiers and I will be staking our lives on SIG weapons. But getting to the point, we'll start with my personal experience with the M17. I've been in 3 different units since the M17 has been fielded, and thus have been issued and qualified with 3 different M17s, and have at least 500 rounds through them personally. I've witnessed 600-ish M17s in operation, firing a combined total of at least 30,000 rounds. And I've never witnessed a catastrophic malfunction of the M17. I've only witnessed one major malfunction, but that was due to a kid in the brigade HHC who was shooting a pistol for the first time, putting the magazine in backwards. I have, however, come to find that the M17 is prone to an operator-induced minor malfunction, though. If you take a thumbs forward grip with the M17 and your thumb or glove touches the slide really at all, it will slow the slide down enough that we'll fail to achieve the last round hold open. I had this failure 3 times before I figured out what was going on, and twice more after on accident. So even though it's the Army standard to wear gloves while operating a weapon, I don't for this reason. So if they're making upgrades, I'd like to see that recoil spring retuned. But aside from this, I've never had a failure to feed or a failure to cycle. Which leads me to the excellent video James Reeves put out on his personal channel where he goes over how the SIG P320 came to be the M17. He talks about the M9A3 and the Glock 19X, which were also up for consideration. It's an informative video and you should check it out if you haven't already. Link in the description. But the parts of his video that are salient to this conversation are that the Government Accountability Office investigation into the testing and contracting process found that there wasn't significant difference in the performance between the P320 and the 19X, while there was a significant difference in price. As such, any areas where the 19X outperformed the P320 were not collectively significant enough to justify the 37% additional cost. So yes, the Army did cut the testing short, but the GAO finding was that it was unlikely Glock would have won had the test been completed as prescribed. The test did, however, reveal several issues with the P320 that the DoD demanded be fixed and upgraded before adoption. This included the notorious drop safety issue, which was fixed by the DoD mandated upgrades. It also included many enhancements that caused the P320 to go from being less reliable than the M9 in its initial tests with 343 mean rounds between stoppages versus the M9's 1,750 to exceeding the reliability of the M9 with 1,880 mean rounds between stoppages after the upgrades. So all available data suggests that the actual weapon that was delivered to me as the end user is both more accurate and more reliable than the weapon it replaced. Withholding the safety issues, this jives with my judgment and the judgment of every other soldier I've discussed this with, that the M17 is an upgrade over the M9. But that brings us to the safety issues. There have been roughly 200 claims that the P320 has discharged uncommanded, meaning that the trigger was never pulled, including now an incident where a US airman was killed by his own service weapon when it reportedly discharged from him simply removing the weapon in its duty holster and placing it on his desk. And whereas there is some video evidence of these occurrences happening, neither the SIG engineers nor the independent labs that were tapped for the following lawsuits were able to replicate the malfunction. The theories as to why this is happening include the potential for tolerance stacking, which is when all of the parts of a mechanism are within the prescribed deviation, but if the deviation on each part are all on the plus side or all on the negative side, it can still cause the mechanism to fail. The other leading theory is that this is just an inherent vulnerability of striker fire pistols with light triggers. The old-timers online pointed out that back in the 80s, Glock had a similar problem, and these negligent discharges were so common that they called getting shot with your own gun Glock leg. But then, while I was writing this video, we got a video from the Wyoming Gun Project channel, where he was able to generate the malfunction in question by using a screw to take the travel out of the trigger, at which point applying pressure to or twisting the slide would cause the weapon to discharge. Whereas he used a screw to induce this pressure on the trigger, similar conditions could conceivably be generated by anything snagging on the trigger in the holster or during the holstering process, or potentially by the aforementioned tolerance stacking. Now, many of my contemporaries on YouTube have been saying that this video finishes off the 320 for good, but I argue it's the exact opposite. You can't fix a problem until you know what's causing it. And Ian, over on the Forgotten Arms channel, made a good point in his video on the subject, which is that if SIG knew what the problem was, they would have assuredly fixed it by now. But given the fact that neither the SIG engineers nor any third-party lab was ever able to replicate the malfunction, it's very likely that they don't know what's causing it, and thus can't fix it. But this brings me to another point about some of the blowback SIG has been getting, which is that it's actually very likely that SIG honestly believes that there isn't a problem with the P320, and it's not that they're trying to gaslight the public. Negligent discharges happen all the time, and people often try to blame it on the firearm out of embarrassment or to try to get out of trouble. And when you add in multi-million-dollar lawsuits, they have every reason in the world to lie about what actually happened. Couple this with the fact that neither the SIG engineers nor any third-party lab was ever able to replicate the malfunction, and SIG may genuinely believe that they're getting played by haters and opportunists. Now, I'm not saying that that's the case, but it is plausible that that's what they truly believe. But now that an airman is dead, unless there's some extremely exculpatory evidence that comes out of the Air Force's investigation, there is no denying that there's a very serious problem with the P320. First off, in the wake of the incident, the Air Force has ordered that no M18s, the variant of the P320 adopted by the Air Force, will be used on duty until further notice pending a full investigation into the incident. This was absolutely the correct call by the Air Force and the subordinate commands in question. Second, on to the officer work and breaking out the composite risk matrix. This is the tool that we use in the Army to assess risk. It looks at the severity of the potential hazard and the likelihood that that hazard transpires. So now that a service member has been killed, the severity category is now extremely high. As for the likelihood of this hazard occurring, let's do a little bit of math. There have been approximately 200 reported cases of uncommanded discharges of the P320. Furthermore, there have been approximately 2.5 million P320s sold. If this is representative of the true failure rate, then that means that there's a 0.008% chance that any given P320 is faulty. The DoD purchased 421,000 P320s, which means 34 of them are most likely faulty. So far, there have been 9 reported incidents of uncommanded discharges of P320s DoD-wide, which means, statistically speaking, there are 25 more faulty P320s floating around the DoD somewhere. Now, this is assuming that the root cause is something like tolerance stacking, and there's a small number of weapons that were manufactured faulty, as opposed to some other form of design defect where the failure state is a state that any P320 can be put into under the right circumstances. Furthermore, this is very back-of-the-envelope math. It doesn't take into account a myriad of factors I'm not privy to the data on. So I strongly encourage my peers in the Officer Corps who have proponency over this program to build a sophisticated enough mathematic model that we can get a more accurate picture. But with this back-of-the-envelope math suggesting that another 25 service members could be killed or maimed, we need to put that number into context. If we only had 25 casualties in a large-scale combat operation, that would be a spectacularly successful operation. However, 25 service members potentially being killed by their own equipment, I would argue, is an unacceptable level of risk. But officially, the frequency is somewhere in the seldom to unlikely range. But even at unlikely, we're left with an initial risk level of moderate. This is the level of risk we accept for live fire training events. So best case scenario, just carrying a loaded M17 is as risky as conducting live fire training. And worst case, the initial risk level is high, and carrying an M17 is as risky as maneuver live fire training or live explosives training. Now, those of you familiar with the composite risk matrix are saying, you didn't apply mitigation measures. The residual risk should be lower. But therein lies the rub. If we don't know why this is happening, we don't know what mitigation measures would actually be effective. And as such, we can't actually lower the residual risk level. And the initial risk and the residual risk are the same. So at this point, it's incumbent on us, the officer corps, to insist that SIG fixes the P320, or for the safety of the force, we need to remove it from service. So I would strongly recommend that the SIG engineers dig into the Wyoming Gun Project video and see if they can use his insights to finally figure out what's going on. Because if they can fix it, it will be far cheaper and easier for the DoD, and thus the American taxpayer, to keep it. All available data suggests the P320 is a good gun with a fatal flaw. So there is something we're salvaging here. But when that fatal flaw means service members killed with their own equipment, that's a flaw we absolutely cannot abide. But that's going to be it for me. So if you found this information useful, give me the old controlled pair on the like and subscribe buttons. And if you found this information useful enough that you want to buy me a beer about it, there's a link to my Patreon and Subscribe Star in the description. So until next time, this is James Merritt for Readiness Nation, reminding you to always be the master of your fate, the captain of your soul.